Well, my question for you to start with, as a founder of Botanical Gardens Conservation International, to talk about botanical gardens and their conservation efforts across the world.
Well, Eric, it's really a pleasure to get with you today to talk about conservation, which is I know a passion for both of us. The most of my career has been spent in botanic gardens, and indeed specifically working to enhance the role that botanic gardens can play in plant conservation. When I started in my first job after university, it was to be curator of a small botanic garden for Trinity College, Dublin, in Ireland. And I became interested in plant conservation when I discovered that some of the plants we had in cultivation in the garden were listed in the IUCN, first IUCN red list of endangered plants. And I realized that the little botanic garden for the university could play a role in plant conservation. And so my interest in plant conservation grew and developed over the years. I remember leading in the 1980s, mid 1980s, I led an expedition to the island of Mauritius, where I was involved in helping to set up plant propagation facilities and activities for some of the really rare and endangered plant species of that island, and got to know people who've been lifetime friends subsequently, like Carl Jones, who has given a lifetime of work to conservation of species like the Mauritius kestrel and the pink pigeon and the Mauritius echo parakeet. But and in some ways my task has mirrored that with conservation of some of the endangered plants of Mauritius and indeed other parts of the world too. After my time as curator of the Botanic Garden in Dublin, I moved on a sabbatical to join IUCN to help set up a secretariat for Botanic Gardens to enhance the work that Botanic Gardens would do in plant conservation. And that network grew to become an organization, independent organization in its own right, Botanic Gardens Conservation International. And I was Secretary General of that for many years before moving on to return to Ireland as director of the National Botanic Gardens, and then coming to become president of the Missouri Botanical Garden in St. Louis in 2010. And all along, I've been able to keep up my interest in plant conservation throughout those changes, in those career changes.
My understanding is you led the global strategy for IUCN on plant conservation.
Well, I have been heavily involved in global strategies for botanic gardens and indeed for plant conservation. In 2000, I was an author of the International Agenda for Botanic Gardens and Plant Conservation, which became a framework document, policy document for botanic gardens in what work they could do in plant conservation. But in 1999, in St. Louis, the International Botanical Congress was held, and that included about 5,000 botanists came to participate in that International Botanical Congress. And one of the resolutions of that Congress was that really the development of a global plant conservation focus and strategy plan needed to be put in place. And subsequently, I took up the baton with others, and we proposed that a new global plant conservation strategy was needed. And decided really that the best home for that would be with the Convention on Biological Diversity. So obviously organizations like IUCN have been involved in that and continue to be involved in that. But really, as the framework for biodiversity conservation worldwide, the Convention on Biological Diversity was absolutely the right place for such a strategy. We presented a case to the convention, and then in 2002 the Biodiversity Convention adopted a decision to create a global strategy for plant conservation with 16 targets to be implemented by every country in the world that is a part of the Biodiversity Convention. We created in 2004 then a global partnership for plant conservation, which I've been a chair of since then, or a co-chair of, and that is to support countries to implement the global strategy for plant conservation. And those 16 targets, which were renewed then in 2010, ran up to 2020 and really provided the guidance for the individual actions made by countries and indeed by so many organizations and indeed hundreds of botanic gardens worldwide on what plant conservation needs to be achieved to conserve plant species worldwide and indeed their habitats too. And that strategy is still provides the framework for what each one of us does in our own individual botanic gardens. I mean, for example, at the Missouri Botanical Garden, our strategic plan is firmly anchored in the objectives of the global strategy for plant conservation. And so it's obvious that I should be playing a key role and indeed supporting and working with partners around the world to ensure that goes ahead. This is a crucial year for the global strategy for plant conservation, because as you know, the Convention on Biological Diversity is currently negotiating the development and indeed we hope later this year the adoption of a global biodiversity framework, which will have a series of targets to be achieved by 2030 on the conservation of the world's biodiversity. Now, we have worked to make a very strong case for the continuation of the global strategy for plant conservation as part of that fitting right into that global biodiversity framework. And just last month, the Biodiversity Convention's conference that was held in Geneva in Switzerland, meetings of its subsidiary body and science and technical advice and its subsidiary body on implementation met, and it adopted a recommendation which will go to the Conference of the Parties when it meets in China later this year, that the development of a new phase of the global strategy for plant conservation should go ahead and be developed in collaboration with the Global Partnership for Plant Conservation, and to put in place as a component of the new Global Biodiversity Framework. So, sorry, that's a very long answer to your question. No. But at least it gives the framework in which the plant conservation efforts of individual institutions and countries can contribute to the global scene in ensuring that biodiversity is sustained for the future.
Well, I'm going to jump ahead because that was really inspirational. Is there would you be willing to talk to the World Association of Zoos and Aquariums? Because I think they would gain from hearing what the botanical garden industry has done. I think in many ways you're out there in front, and they're working on doing conservation, but I think what you just described will be inspiring to them.
Well, always happy to. If the more conservationists, biodiversity conservationists who are effective around the world, the better, because it is really one of the great global challenges that we all face, and if we can change hearts and minds and policies and actions, then we must do so. And it all comes down to what individual actions each one of us takes to contribute to the whole. So yes, absolutely. I think that where botanic gardens have been very effective over the last few decades is in getting their act together and developing shared policies and shared practices, and continuing to look at how they can scale up what they're doing individually and then collectively to contribute to a coordinated framework. And organizations like Botanic Gardens Conservation International have been very, very effective in linking what's happening in one part of the world with what is happening in another part of the world, and then monitoring whether we are individually and collectively delivering on the promises we make.
Well, and as you know, I'm retired from St. Louis in the Madagascar Fauna Group, and that's one area where we interacted with the Missouri Botanical Garden. But do you see other areas where zoos and botanical gardens can make a bigger impact by being together?
Absolutely. I think it's essential. I mean, I would say that the Madagascar Fauna Group is now the Madagascar Fauna and Flora Group. So
yeah,
absolutely, there is.
I was going to correct you. We call it NF squared G.
we are part of the same task to undertake this work together. I mean, plants rely on pollinators and dispersers of seed. Animals rely on the food and shelter and habitat that plants provide. So we really cannot do it in isolation. I think there is, for zoos and botanic gardens, a lot of their work, particularly in ex situ conservation, has to be done separately, but we can learn from each other. And I think that one of the ways that the botanic garden community has learned from zoos is the focus that zoos have on pedigrees and on understanding genetic diversity and in ensuring that gene pools are maximized for threatened plant species. And increasingly, botanic gardens are doing that same work. I think when you think about the extent to which the world's plants are threatened, currently about a third of the world's plants, some 100,000 plant species plus, are threatened with extinction in the wild. And we do need to have really effective ex situ conservation measures in place as a backup to in situ conservation. And indeed, as climate change grows, as it is expected to, there are many cases where plants and animals will only be able to survive in ex situ institutions because their home habitats and known distributions may no longer exist in a form that will sustain them. So I think we have to make sure that zoos and botanic gardens really work closely together to not only to share expertise but also to ensure that we are spreading a collective message to the world's people on the essential nature of biodiversity for ourselves and for future generations.
Well, and I would just comment on MFFG. You are sponsoring an endangered plant breeding center next to the zoo that's breeding endangered species. So that's kind of where it needs to be connected.
Yes, it is I think we all realize that conservation of important areas for biodiversity is ultimately going to be where the biodiversity of the plants and animals have to be conserved. But to get there, we need to take the measures that zoos and botanic gardens are doing in breeding, in plant propagation, in ecological restoration, in understanding and documenting the plant and animal species that make up these habitats. And we know, for example, that in the plant world that about 2,000 new plant species are being discovered and described and named each year. And most of those, as soon as they are described, are going on to the IUCN Red List of threatened species. And if we don't take urgent measures to document them and then to conserve them, they will disappear, and we will lose tens of thousands of species. From the point of view of the world of zoos, the task is huge, because we all see that there are a multitude of species which cannot be managed in any of our institutions. Just think, for example, all of the insect life, the invertebrates, and the microflora and fauna that may occur in habitats. And we are just scraping the tip of the iceberg, which is melting fast, in the work we do. And all we can do ultimately is try to use our expertise that we are developing in ecological restoration and make sure that the species, that the rest of the world's biota relies on, is in a form that will be self-sustaining of those species.
Well, that's a sad quote, but dead on, about the iceberg is melting fast. I will be using that one because, we're watching it go down the drain. Excuse me, I'm hoarse today. Is there anything else you'd like to add? Because I think that covered well what we wanted to discuss today, because we just wanted to make it clear that botanical gardens and zoos have not interacted as well as they could have.
I think there is a lot for us to do together, and that we need to, and the will is there. I think that there are many opportunities for us to make sure that we stand up together and make the case for greater resources for biodiversity conservation and the work that we do together, and connect where we need to in terms of things like pollinator studies and because that is going to be essential. Many species are going to disappear because they have lost their pollinators. They may not be threatened where they are, but if the pollinators disappear, then those plants are going to go, and vice versa. I think we also have to make the case that biodiversity is what sustains our human species, as well as we lose tens of thousands of plants and animals that are providing us with our sustainability, our sustainable planet. I also think that there is an awful lot more that zoos and botanic gardens can do to document the species of the planet. I mean, one of the projects that the botanic gardens of the world have spearheaded over the last 8, 9, 10 years is to try to create a flora of the world online. And that was called for in the Global Strategy for Plant Conservation. Well, we now have 1.6 million plant names in a world flora online to provide a baseline of knowledge on the world's plants. That includes 400,000 descriptions of plants. And if we don't know and fully understand the species we're working with, then how can we even attempt to conserve them? So there is a real basis of knowledge that zoos and botanic gardens need to work together on, and to learn from each other on how we will document these species as a starting point for effective conservation.
Well, thank you so much for those insights. I totally agree. I always think about the Missouri Botanical Gardens creating the flora of China. Once they knew what they had, then they could know what was endangered. You know, you have to know what you have to understand what you might lose.
Yes, indeed. You're absolutely correct about that. It becomes part of the palette of tools we have in our painting box, as it were, or toolbox to move forward.
Well, again, for those I want to keep you with that. It's been extremely helpful, and I think it will help zoo people think over a broader palette, to use your term, than they have maybe in the past.
Well, Eric, it's a pleasure to see you, and great to have a chance to talk to you today. So many thanks.
Yes, and I hope we catch up soon. So I'll talk to you later.
Great. Bye-bye.
Bye.